Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. After 5 years of the Me Too movement and modest wins for women's workplace rights, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that recognized women's constitutional right to abortion, a decision condemned by President Joe Biden that will dramatically change life for millions of women in America and also exacerbate growing tensions in a deeply polarized country. Experts say there is no denying the fact that this is a direct attack on all women, and women of color stand to be disproportionately impacted by the court's egregious assault on basic human rights. For more on the experiences of women of color and their lifelong commitment to challenging oppressive practices, we're now joined by feminist scholar and activist Chandra Talpade Mohanty, Distinguished Professor and Dean's Professor of the Humanities, Women and Gender Studies at Syracuse University. Professor Mohanty, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm delighted to be here.
So can we talk about your response to the Supreme Court's overturning Roe after almost 50 years?
Well, lots of different emotions, I would say. And on the one hand, not very surprised by it, but completely enraged. Just really, I think my main reaction is rage. And it makes it, I mean, this decision, I think, has really confirmed, I guess, my sense that the struggles that we have all been involved in around feminism, around just a lot of different basic equity and human rights, the struggles continue, and we're in a moment which really requires both all of us, not just women, all of us, being out in the streets, strategizing, organizing, teaching about what the consequences are of this decision,
Yeah. Now, your research focuses on the relation of feminist knowledges and scholarship to organizing and social movements. Let's talk about how we got here, the reaches of this ruling in the feminist movement, and ultimately the disparate effects, as you rightly point out, of this ruling on women of color.
So one of the things I would say we have to understand is this whole neoliberal landscape that we are in. And that landscape basically means the privatization of all social justice commitments. Okay, and what does that mean? It means there were social justice commitments that were made possible by the radical movements in the 60s and the 70s and early 80s, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, so these commitments led to certain kind of policies and certain, policies, right? Public policy of a certain kind. What happens when you privatize that? When you privatize that, these just even the commitments themselves, right? Then institutions can move from having to address themselves to questions of heterosexism, racism, class, poverty, all of these, sexual, all of these things. They can move from there to a very individualized framing, right, of all forms of discrimination and domination as enacted by individuals. right? So if you in fact say that racism doesn't exist, it's only some people who are prejudiced in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the old bad apple
Right, right, right.
argument, right? So if that's how you sort of frame it,
Mm-hmm.
then it's never the case that you will be looking at structural problems because they have disappeared from the public domain. Okay, so that's, I think, really important to understand in terms of why the kind of mobilization that was possible for us early on in the 60s and 70s is, in fact, harder and harder to do. Does
Yeah.
that mean that hasn't happened? No. In fact, a lot of what has happened has been a response by Black and Brown and feminist and queer communities to this kind of neoliberal governmentality,
Mm-hmm.
where, in fact, on the one hand, you have people who have wealth and status and all of this kind of stuff are able to be bona fide citizens.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that are people who are completely criminalized or erased or just incarcerated
Yeah.
in different ways, you know,
Right.
held in place
Yeah.
by capital
Yeah.
and by neoliberal governments.
Yeah.
And I think that that is clear because if you just think about BLM and the rise of all of these movements, you now understand that the movements were responding to that kind of shift in
Yeah.
the political sphere.
Now, another interesting highlight here is that in the context of the ruling is that conservative Justice Clarence Thomas not only sided with the majority, but argued in a concurring opinion that our other key landmark rulings establishing gay rights, the right to contraception as well, should also be overturned. How is, you think, the protection of women's rights, including reproductive health care, connected to LGBTQ issues and equal pay?
Well, I think that they are all completely connected because they are all rights that are about the kinds of choices women, queer people, poor women, women who are fighting for reproductive justice. All of these are choices and rights that are connected
Mhm.
because they are fundamentally about um, the way gender and sexuality are at the heart of what is being policed
Yeah,
here by Justice Thomas.
yeah, yeah.
So he makes a very clear connection. He's smart. And yes, there are these connections. And if we didn't understand the
Mhm,
connections
mhm,
between LGBT rights and abortion rights
mhm.
and the fact that, some part of reproductive justice has also meant women of color, especially Black and Brown women,
Yeah,
fighting to, in fact, have babies and not
yeah,
be sterilized,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So all of those are connected, and fundamentally, they are about gendered bodies,
yeah,
yeah, and
yeah,
how gendered bodies are framed, policed, and contained by
yeah,
the state. So a fight for against a fight for abortion rights simultaneously has to be an anti-racist fight, has
yeah,
to be a fight for queer rights,
yeah.
fight against sort of the growth of capitalism and neoliberalism. So all of those, to me, if we don't connect it,
Mhm.
then we remain within these kinds of siloed understanding.
I want to talk a little bit about your book because I think it might it actually be an invitation, an appropriate invitation for viewers to sort of dig a little bit deeper into where we are in the movement. Now, in context, two books written in the past couple of years have really given me pause. One by a friend of mine, Chinzia Ruza. She wrote Feminism for 99%, a Communist Manifesto. I love that book. She was
Yes.
the co-author of that book. And also the second book, which I read very recently, is Feminist Freedom Warriors, your book, which tells the stories of women of color. It really feels like an archive of feminist activism from the global South. That's what it is. It's echoing their stories, their experiences.
Yes.
Why did you write this book?
So the book is, in fact, first of all, the project is a collaborative project with my colleague and sister friend, Linda Carty, who has been in African American studies for a long time, and she's been a colleague at Syracuse University. So this project, the book, is in fact connected to the larger video archive project that we began in 2015 as a way of really trying to create a digital virtual space where some of the most significant, I think, feminists, kick-ass feminists, really, from the global South and the global North, would be able to have we would be able to have conversations with them, kitchen table conversations about their thinking about feminist movements, their thinking about the world in which we are all in right now, and the kind of priorities that they have written about and have organized around, depending on the geopolitical space that they occupy, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, it is a lot of people from the global South, and there are, of course, a lot of women of color and a few anti-racist white feminists from the US. And the point is really to see how, one, the connection between people's personal and political lives, and to really see the connection between thinking or ways of theorizing and strategizing and politics and movement building. And when you see all of these next to each other, I think, and that's why we have, I think, about 40 conversations right now.
Yeah.
And the book, in fact, is connected to that. So in the book, we have, I think, maybe 7 or 8 sort of conversations. And what it shows, I believe, is a sort of very radical and insurgent transnational feminist praxis.
Yeah.
If you read those stories, right? So, and I have always believed that stories really are powerful, right? Narratives are powerful. So while you could read an essay or a book by an Angela Davis, you really learn more from watching or having a conversation with Angela, that in which she is able to map, in fact, the growth of her political consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, all of the women interviewed in the book discuss the state of women in what I really liked about it, the state of women in specific professions at the time, the
Yes.
wage gap between men and women, the status of women in home, and the reaction of the mainstream directed towards women's liberation movement, just generally.
Right.
I want to start by talking about the experiences of women in academia, and I know that you and I both sort of have traveled. You've traveled this journey many years beyond
Yes.
me, but it's important to sort of zero in on the experiences of these women in these different spaces. Can you tell us about the experiences of women in the academy, how we're faring? What was something that sort of came out as a pattern, if you will, in this project?
Right. So I think what I would say, there were many patterns that came, but beyond this pattern that everybody knows, which is that women do not earn as much as men in the academy in general, that in fact the percentage of full professors that are women is much tinier than men, all of these kinds of statistical inequities that I think we now know. I think what emerged was, in some ways, now I'm talking specifically about being a woman of color or being a Black or brown or indigenous woman in the academy. The academy was really, or higher education in the US, was never really made with us in mind. So if you ask me, who is the citizen that is imagined in American higher education, I would say it is none of us. Okay? So what does that mean then? That means that we, in fact, have had to acknowledge the violence of the academy and figure out strategies of surviving and thriving. So what I think these stories tell is, one, why the academy has been such a difficult site that needs decolonization at many levels, and two, why simultaneously, and I deeply believe this, it is in fact a site where you can create spaces of liberation. Okay, and so this is not a very popular view. But what I mean by that is that there's something that about education that I find deeply hopeful. Yeah, as a practice.
For sure.
So there are things we can do in our classrooms to actually shift people's thinking. That's one. That's the teaching part, pedagogical. And a lot of what I try to do is to really analyze the institution, the academy, and how we can, specifically, I'm teaching at Syracuse, so I look at Syracuse. I have my students look at Syracuse. And what are the spaces that we can push, that we can push back in some ways, right? So there's that. But the other piece is the kind of knowledge we can produce. We have access to libraries, we have access to resources in the academy. And I think that another thing that comes through in a number of people who are thinking critically about the academy is, how do we use that privilege? How do we to create knowledges that are insurgent, knowledges that are actually decolonizing knowledges, right? And knowledges that are not just relegated to the margins. That the task, I think, for us and for a number of the women we speak to, I think, is both acknowledging the violences of the academy and at the same time figuring out how to build communities of dissent in the academy, within those spaces. And in my opinion, this is how I have survived, and how everyone I know, who's in this position, has actually not just survived, but we managed to do things. We publish books, we teach, I don't know. So there are possibilities, I think, that the academy offers that are important. And if you are somebody who really believes in the fact that the kinds of knowledges we produce are key to the way we think about freedom and revolution and liberation and equity, then you can do that work.
Can we talk a little bit about representation in the feminist movement? The Women's March on Washington in 2017 was largely seen as a march for women's unity. But the often fractious relationship between white feminists and women of color is really giving rise to almost new tensions. What's going on here?
Well, This has a long history, as you know, right?
Yeah.
There is a long history of tension or division between a particular kind of white feminist movement, theorizing, all of this. And I would go another step, which is it's not just white feminism, it's also a particular kind of understanding of Western feminism, which dominates or has dominated thinking about and organizing around feminism also in the global South,
Right.
right? So, which doesn't mean that people have not organized on their own ground in the global South. All it means is we've had to fight that battle as well. Um, so I guess I would say that much of the work that people in my generation did, Sophia, okay, and this is people who are doing work in the 70s, women of color, in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s primarily, that work, in fact, I think, has led to a different kind of understanding of white feminism or Western feminism, in the sense that there is much more of there's much more connection between the feminist praxis of Black and Brown and Indigenous women and anti-racist white women. So I guess what I would say is anti-imperialist and anti-racist white women, in fact, are, especially in younger generations, I'm pleased to say,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are many more of them.
Yeah.
Okay? So instead of focusing so much on this sort of the representation and the visuals
Yeah.
of the domination of white women, sometimes I think that those of us who are in feminist struggle spend too much time thinking about, okay, so why is it that we are not being acknowledged? I don't think it's about that. I
Yeah.
think it's about figuring out what is the fight
Yeah. Yeah.
and what is strategically the best thing you can do, and how do you create connections, and who are the white women you can connect with.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
honestly don't think you can not have anti-racist white women in the struggle. They need to be there. And
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Even when we talk about sort of the experiences of women of color in the academy, we need allies, and it's
of
not a
course,
one-way street. We need white women, and white women need us, right? It
exactly.
feels like a lot of what we do will be better off collaborating.
Yeah, yeah. But more than that, I think it's also to make sure we are clear that, white woman isn't a one holistic category, right?
Sure.
That's why I keep saying anti-racist white women. In the same way,
Ah,
within our own communities, there are sisters who are not sisters.
oh, for sure, 100%.
So, so there you go. So I think that's really so for me, the point of connection has to be our ethics and politics across these borders.
What should advocacy and activism look like in the era of feminist freedom warriors?
Whoa, big question.
Good question for the distinguished professor.
Yes, I know, but now in what, 10 words or less? Okay. So okay, there are a few things that advocacy and activism need to do. And this is why I think, I see scholar activism as so key, thinking about questions of advocacy and activism, right? Which is the way we think, the way we understand, the way we read history has everything to do with the way we understand power at the moment and what we have to fight and the strategies we come up with. So I think what is necessary is crossing borders, which is fundamental to feminist freedom warriors and to my book and to everything else I do. Crossing borders, but crossing borders in ethical and smart and historicized ways, understanding. One. Two, always try to figure out what our interconnected histories are. Yeah. So, and that gives us a way of making connections and challenging each other at the same time.
Right.
Okay. So that's the second thing. And then I would say the third thing is building intersectional social movements, right? That we have to do that. And I'm now using intersectional in very specific ways. Yeah. I think that words like intersectional, again, have been completely co opted by neoliberal discourses as well, right? I mean, people don't have to connect intersectional to anti racist work, to anti heterosexist, or queer work, or anti capitalist work. You just say intersectional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't just say intersectional. So when I say intersectional movements, I think these are movements, and I honestly believe that there are movements now on the ground in this country and elsewhere where people actually have figured out what it is to make these connections and to organize together and to work together. And sometimes our theory, really is way behind and we haven't caught up.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of, you know, I think, okay, and if I were to name issues, right, this is what is so important for feminists. So, racial capitalism, we have to fight. We have to fight neoliberal government governing practices. We have to fight the rise of militarism, the rise of fascist, white supremacist, religious supremacist states and policies around the world. Yeah. So, because when I talk about white supremacy here, my other space, my other part of my head is thinking about Brahminical supremacy in India.
Huh.
Yeah. And what are the analogies? What are the ways we have to make connections between anti caste and anti race praxis and politics? Right. So I think that strategically, we can think about what is in common. We can think about historically what's in common. Yeah. But we need to organize on the ground where we are.
Yeah.
So that's what is necessary for advocacy and activism. Being very deliberate and concrete about what we're looking at, being grounded in the space we are in and the histories we've inherited, and they're fighting, and that we want to mobilize both the histories of liberation, imagination of freedom, and the histories of domination and violence that we inherit, right? To be very conscious of that and to really work where we are. Work, don't, I don't like thinking about advocacy as charity. I'm very, very, I just very sensitive to that. So before you go out and work in the third world for third world women's whatever, liberation from anything, please figure out what you in your own community can do.
Right. Absolutely. I appreciate your time. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, Professor Mohanty, author of Feminist Freedom Warriors. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks, Sophia. It's been a pleasure.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.